What is the soul trade? In brief, it is the dealing in souls of the dead for the benefit of those who want to use those souls. That's the dictionary definition, as it were. To expand a bit, the souls of dead mortals appear on the outer planes where they can be gathered and sold to beings who want to put those souls to a variety of uses. This trade is the backbone of planar commerce. This is especially true on the lower planes, but as we'll get to, the soul trade also has an impact on other planes as well. The quintessential image of the soul trade is of a night hag wrangling larvae for sale. However, this is just what we can call the first step in the soul trade. It's a vital step, but it's not going to give the entire picture, even if sources rarely mention much more than this. Putting together a good picture of the soul trade requires looking into a number of sources that seem only tangentially related and drawing them all together. We will have to talk some simple economics as part of this, but I will try to make it easily digestible. That said, this will be a lengthy exploration of the topic, so you may wish to get yourself settled now. As ever in this History of the Blood War series, I am your narrator, Jay Unwuka, and I hope that you will keep an open mind as we discuss this reprehensible trade. Though this episode will be centered squarely on the soul trade itself, I will be tying it back into the Blood War more explicitly at the end. Before I go further, I want to make clear that quite a bit of this episode is speculation, but I will present the evidence that I've found and my lines of thought along with my statements. I've done my best to analyze all the sources which touch on the soul trade, and though you do so directly, I believe there are many valuable insights we can use to build our image of this eternal enterprise. Part 1. Souls for Sale. In talking about the soul trade, the first thing that should be noted is that the trade in larvae is not the whole thing. In fact, I identify two main parts of the soul trade: the larva trade, aka the bulk trade, and the custom trade, aka the specialty trade. And to tell the truth, the larva trade isn't just larvae. Enslaved petitioners, soul gems, liquid pain, and similar assets are also traded and can do many of the things that larvae can. But before we go too far down that path, let's discuss just what a larva is. All larvae begin as a mortal soul, so the first thing to ask is, what is a soul? Nailing this one down has stumped philosophers for ages, and I won't be the one to give a broad, final definition. Let's settle instead for some common understandings. Most agree that a soul is the essence of a person which is released and exists independently after the person's mortal death. This soul essence has a level of potency which can be used as an aid and as fuel in magical work. When mortals die, their soul transfers to the outer plane which best matches their persona in life, or to the plane of a deity they worshipped, provided that the deity claims them as well. How this process works is unclear. It's possible that each prime material world has its own way of releasing its dead, but it has been reliably observed that a person's soul appears on one of the outer planes shortly after death. When a soul arrives on an outer plane, it immediately becomes a denatured version of its former self, which is called a petitioner. This denaturing is important because it makes each petitioner more or less equal to every other one of its type. That is to say, though a great hero's living soul may be more potent than the average commoner's, once they become petitioners, their soul potency is equal. We'll come back to living souls in a bit, but for now, let's press on with the dead. Each outer plane has petitioners that are shaped by the plane. A petitioner on Celestia is different, but still equivalent to a petitioner in the Abyss. A particular type of petitioner is the larva. While most petitioners retain a form that is something like they were in life, the only part of a larva's living form that remains is a twisted version of their face. The rest of a larva is a person-sized worm about 5 feet long, grotesque, covered in slime, and totally repulsive. Larvae are said to be from the souls of people who were unspeakably selfish in life. Given that petitioners rarely remember their lives, I'm not sure how this has been confirmed, but it is reliably repeated. Older sources say that larvae emerged throughout the lower planes, but most say that they arise on only one, the gray waste of Hades. From what I've said, the question that needs answering is why larvae became so widely traded. If all petitioners are equally potent, why aren't others bought and sold the same way? The answer is twofold. In the first place, larvae are much easier to handle. Most petitioners keep their shape, which means they are able to flee or struggle. Larvae, on the other hand, cannot move very fast or put up a fight. In the second place, larvae are useful stock for magical purposes. Different petitioners are harder to tap into the essences of, often due to their innate tie to their home play. Petitioners on Beator, for instance, are resistant to anything that tries to turn them from becoming lemures. Larvae, on the other hand, are easy to exploit. Plus, for those who need strong minions quickly, larvae are much easier to directly uplift than a lemure or a manes would be. We'll dive deeper into how trades actually operate in short order, but first I want to deal with two other common items that are traded: advance contracts and standard or loan contracts. A standard contract is the common Faustian bargain of selling your soul to a fiend for a certain price. Many of these contracts, if not the majority, would be written in such a way as to allow them being traded from person to person. The benefit of signing standard contracts with living mortals is that the soul is seized just at the moment of death, before it becomes a proper petitioner, meaning that the uniqueness and potency of their life is intact. This is how most powerful mortals are recruited into the ranks of devils and demons, without having to suffer through inhabiting the lesser forms. The other type of contract is the advance contract. Now, though the source I draw this information from calls these soul futures, the actual process seems closer to a forward contract in my limited understanding of economic details. So I just chose to call them advance contracts to skip over any possible confusion and hopefully not ruffle the feathers of economists. Basically, a soul advance contract is one where a provider agrees to give a certain number and or kind of souls to the buyer at a specified future date, in exchange for getting money up front from the buyer. These advance contracts are most straightforwardly used as ways to get quick money for providers, but canny merchants can make money buying and selling these contracts at opportune times. The risk in an advance contract for the reseller is that they usually do not have the means to fulfill the contract immediately. Many merchants will try to sell their contract on before needing to fulfill it themselves. Though advance contracts can be used for bulk larvae purchases, most often they are used when specific kinds of souls are needed and therefore must be specially procured. Just like in our world, dealing in financial instruments is a game best left to the rich. The next natural topic, in my view, is exactly how souls are used as currency. Again, we can divide this into two. How does a soul get value, and what forms do souls take when used as money? For the question of value, souls get that value from their use. Souls have three uses: as food, as stores of magical power, and as stock to transform into new bodies. For instance, this is how devils turn larvae into imps and so forth. I'll talk more about these later, but I introduced them now to help establish a baseline for value. Now, the newest sources give fairly precise workings of labor to gold value when working with magical items, and I've been able to come up with a formula to give an estimated base value of a denatured soul. Many details come from the World Tree era, but there is some commonality between prices of that time and the modern age. I will now give this working, but I warn you, this is arcane stuff. I won't stop to explain this, but it may help you if you are familiar with the symbology. Here is the formula. If 1 soul equals 10 XP, and 1 XP equals 5 GP, then 1 soul equals 50 GP. Now, don't say I didn't warn you. Now, though this seems cut and dry for those of us who understand, my sources tell me that a standard magical sword, the kind that is usually found among Blood War troops, will cost anywhere from 2 to 10 souls today, but during the World Tree such a weapon would run north of 40. Regardless, the value of one denatured soul is the basis for all prices in the soul trade. That brings us to the forms that souls take as tradable objects. We've already discussed a few: larvae, enslaved petitioners, and contracts. There are other notable forms, however. One that has caught the eye of many mortals is the soul coin. These are minted on Minoros, the third of the 9 hells, in the city of the same name. Soul coins are about 5 inches in diameter and weigh 1/3 of a pound, or 150 grams, which is much too large for a normal human to use casually, and they are made of infernal iron. These coins are each infused with a single tormented soul. Though it seems like soul coins would be a great form of currency for non-mortals, since many planar beings are quite large, they have flaws in this regard. First, the store of infernal iron isn't certain, and using metal at all adds an extra cost. Second, coins can't be used as food or transmogrification stock, and they are also very limited in their use as a source of potency. Third, while a soul is imprisoned when inside a soul coin, the holder has no long-term control over the soul if it's released, and releasing it is the only way to access its true potency. Using soul coins for power would require a process to catch these newly released souls, something which is complex even for skilled mages. Despite the heavy production of these, I don't see soul coins as playing a great role in the soul trade, even as a trade good. The other major forms of capturing the soul for commerce are fairly similar to the coins: soul gems and soul cages, which can be used by any spellcaster, and soul bags, which are used by night hags. Each traps the soul inside a container until some other magic releases it. The main advantage these forms have over coins is that while coins house denatured souls, gems etc. hold as living souls, which is to say, with their full potency. However, since it is still difficult to control just released souls, and none of the containers allow using the soul while it's still inside, their use in trade is likewise limited. If someone's specific essence is wanted, a contract on the soul gives the contract holder much more power over that soul. Still, gems and so on are still traded, since they are especially useful in capturing those who resist temptations. Be warned though, if you agree to deliver a soul contract and deliver a soul gem instead, expect to offer up a steep discount to your potential buyer. And if you offer it yourself, it will even be voluntary. Given all these different forms, which would be the standard when used as a daily currency? Larvae and petitioners are too large to be used for basic transactions. Soul coins seem ready-made, but they don't actually work that well as currency. For one, the usability of a soul coin is much more limited than that of a larva, as we discussed. For another, the coin's content is fixed as the soul it currently contains. Now, this might seem to be good to common sense, as everyone can agree on the coin's value, but this is actually bad for its use as currency. To try and explain this, I'm going to heavily simplify ideas set out by Graeber, a scholar of our world, in his work on debt. Briefly, money is valuable for the worth it represents, not the worth of the money object itself. As an example, a gold coin worth £1 is worth that because of the society it's in, not because the gold in the coin is necessarily worth £1. If you've heard of debasement of coinage, this is how that works. By adding less valuable metal, such as copper, in with the normal coin metal, such as gold or silver, while still valuing it the same. Debasement works fine among your own people. The problem with debasement starts when you trade out of your society. That's why gold is good to use in coins. Since almost all societies value gold, you can trade it with a foreigner because, even back in their country, the coin is at least worth its weight in gold. As coins are debased, Foreign trade will become more expensive because it takes more coins to reach the expected amount of gold. This is known as inflation of coinage. Why is all this important for soul coins? Well, soul coins are only ever worth the soul that's inside the coin, as I said. Because larvae are more useful than soul coins, it's unlikely that you'd get one larvae for one coin anywhere outside of Minoros, and possibly elsewhere in Beator. Because coins are less valuable to the end user than larvae, larvae always form the basis of the economy, rendering coins irrelevant for wider trading use. Further, given that contracts covering thousands of larvae are possible, coins are not even the most portable method that we've discussed. So, on both worth and usability, soul coins don't quite reach the level of convenience. Having crossed off these other forms as not great for use in an ongoing economy, what is the form of everyday currency in use? This solution is not one given in the sources, but I think what I am going to suggest makes sense for 3 reasons. First, we know that planar beings are very familiar with contracts. Second, we know that the larva trade is a fluid and active market due to the continued mention of the trade. And third, we know that various bureaucracies are not unknown. With these 3 supporting reasons, I've come up with a solution that may be surprising, but here it is. Bearer bonds. Well, bearer bonds and banknotes. In other words, cash. Like I said, you might not expect beings like devils and demons to use paper money, but remember that paper money in our world developed for exactly this reason, as a convenience for trading. A note of this kind, which says that the entity who wrote the note will pay the bearer, that is, the holder of the note, a certain amount of larvae, is just a step away from a normal contract between 2 named parties. Obviously, any contract or bond used in the soul trade would be made of a sturdier material than mortal paper, but for both mortals and planers, cash rules every amoral merchant. Exactly the type of note you'll use depends on where it comes from. In our world, in our modern time, banks are the main groups that issue bonds and the like, and central banks issue banknotes. For an idea of how it is handled in the soul trade, we need to think more along the lines of medieval finance, where the main issuers of loans were not banks but individual wealthy people. This is good to keep in mind so that we don't start imagining things like a First National Bank of Beator. For the soul trade, each lender, who I'll call a banker from here on, is an independent operator. So why wouldn't modern style banks develop? It's a natural question. One of the things that makes an institution different from someone's personal affairs is that an institution has to figure for employee turnover, even at the top. Since most of the extraplanar wealthy class is immortal, formalizing of the group doesn't have to take place. This doesn't mean that bankers don't have help. Most of the wealthiest bankers have extensive staffs, but they are usually slaves or other unpaid attendants. Mortals are more often treated like what we would consider an employee, working in exchange for a salary, but even then it is more like contracting with a patron than it is like joining a corporation's workforce. Of course, there are long-standing and trusted bankers in the soul trade, but as I've said, you are dealing with a person rather than a brand, as if banking with Lorenzo de Medici or Jacob Fugger. The level of wealth and reliability of a banker goes a long way to determining what type of note you should feel comfortable taking from them. Any banker can choose to issue whatever bonds or cash notes they like, so often the person who is taking the contract will have to be careful of who they deal with. Custom bonds for large amounts are paradoxically easier to trust, as a banker is more likely to check that they have the stock at the time the bond is issued, rather than simply trusting that enough is in circulation. Also, large bonds are not as widely traded as cash notes, which means they are easier for the banker to keep track of. Only the wealthiest and most reputable bankers are widely trusted to issue cash notes, since they have enough money that it is highly unlikely that they will be unable to meet their commitments. The banker themselves would choose the denominations they wanted to issue, so these denominations can vary widely, but most cash notes are considered tradable with each other in principle. Though theoretically anyone can issue such a note, the problem comes with acceptance of the note. Unlike countries in our world, no one is forced to accept any particular note as legal tender. For a cash note to be widely accepted, the banker who issued it has to be trusted by the person who holds it. So, just to double back on this, I will answer this question. Can you use one banker's cash when buying from somewhere else? The answer is yes, as long as the other person trusts the banker to produce the specified larvae when asked. Of course, even these notes promise the usual dire consequences for not meeting payment of a planar contract. If they didn't, no one would give them even a basic level of trust, but anyone operating in the soul trade has likely planned contingencies in this case. Designated fall guys are common, but more intricate legal maneuvers have also been used. To sum all this up, most people who are buying and selling personal goods will probably use cash notes in everyday transactions, while bearer bonds and full contracts are used between merchants and businesses. Coins, gems, and so on aren't used as liquid currency. Instead, they're seen as products and/or commodities. Now, given that cash notes means that someone has to deliver larvae on demand, how exactly does that work? I'll talk more about this process in the part we're diving right into. Part 2. How does the soul trade work? With the grounding from Part 1, we can start getting into the hows and whys of what keeps the soul trade running. For many reasons, it's not as simple as just picking out the larvae you want and working out a trade. Not everyone can get to the larvae plains of Hades, and, more straightforwardly, very few want to make that trip. On the other hand, you are very unlikely to see a night hag gallivanting from plane to plane hawking their slugs. What I want to do in this part is to explain in detail how larvae get from night hag to lich. The best way to get a sense of the larva trade's functioning is to think of this as a supply chain. We start with suppliers who gather and provide the larvae. These are the hags and so on. Suppliers deal with resellers who tend to buy larvae in bulk, then sell it on in pieces and at a markup. Much of the trade then goes to currency holders such as mercenaries and foundries, people who own larvae only for their economic use. Then finally, there are end users, such as liches and powerful fiends, who will actually withdraw larvae for use as food, stock, or magic energy. I feel the need to clarify something here. This supply chain is not rigid at all. Nothing stops a lich from going to Hades and buying ripe larvae directly from a hag. What I'm going to describe is just the general way things go, and I'll support why it shakes out this way as we go along. Let's begin with the suppliers, specifically the hags who control the larvae of Hades. Night hags are the ones who harvest, wrangle, and herd the vast majority of larvae, if not all of them. It's possible that other creatures like Yugoloths might herd some, but the sources only ever mention night hags. Larvae themselves simply appear out of nothing all over the plane of Hades, possibly wriggling fully formed out of the waste soil, and they often appear in groups. Night hags scour the wastes for larvae to add to their herd, building them up until even modest rustlers owned thousands of larvae. It's rumored that the presence of larvae makes new larvae more likely to appear nearby, allowing vast herds to double in size in only a few days. I want to stress again that this is a rumor, one which is hard to verify because of how difficult it is to get good information from the night hags. So how is it that the hags control the larva trade of Hades? Why hasn't some deity or archfiend made themselves overlord of the Grey Wastes? The culprit is most likely the plane's draining aura. The Grey Wastes of Hades are completely suffused with a deep despair and hopelessness. This is known as gloom, with advanced cases recognized as a disease called the Greys. Most beings avoid long stays in Hades because of this. Even greater powers who are unaffected by the sickness will grow gloomier over time, simply due to the gloominess surrounding them. Night hags, on the other hand, thrive in this environment of despair. These hags very likely began rustling larvae for their own food and magical use, but as others began to know of the uses of larvae, a market for the grubs led to hags building up and controlling their huge herds. Since no other beings seem to be able to handle the hard life of a larvae rustler, night hags are left as the major herders and power brokers of the plane. Though night hags are very powerful and very opposed to working with others, they can't control their huge herds entirely by themselves. Typically, a larva rustler has an array of slaves used to do the grunt work. The main jobs which need doing are actually herding the larvae for one and overseeing contracts for another. As I'll talk more about in a bit, night hags will have a great need for contract experts when conducting business. Mephits are the most commonly mentioned thralls of the night hags, mainly used as drovers of larvae. Imps, quasits, tieflings, and cambions are also found in a night hag's service. A hag's top lieutenants, who also suffer their boss's constant direct abuse, tend to be her own daughters, especially if they are night hags as well. Hag rustlers usually try to have 2 or 3 daughters, allowing them to form a covey that they can completely control. Night hags also at times employ sales representatives for off-plane business and will hire spell workers if they themselves are not skilled at creating planar gates and the like. Though these rustlers prefer to only employ slaves, defending the herd is too much for the usual staff, so Yugoloth mercenaries are also common in the service of a wealthy hag. Night hags take part in the soul trade in order to increase their wealth and power, but they do receive something tangible when selling off their stock. They aren't eager to trade for gold unless it is a very large amount of mined gold metal. Any modest amount could be created by magic, and magical gold is always perceived as less valuable. Hags can use gold, gems, and so on to ensnare mortals, which is their favorite pastime, so using these quote-unquote natural types of payment isn't always a lost cause. However, night hags prefer to be paid in magic items or unique living souls. Hags do also buy information, but while they might make a personal trade of larvae for that information, it doesn't have a major economic effect on the soul trade as a good or a service. If they are very cunning, mercantile night hags might try to use advanced contracts to quickly build wealth, but this is a risky strategy, especially in a business where your rivals see you as a potential item to be traded. One of the most important things that the hags get when selling larvae are raid immunity agreements from the Blood War powers. Hades is one of the principal battlefields of the Blood War, and larva herds are obviously tempting targets. Night hags generally make deals with the top demon and devil commanders on the plane, essentially bribing them to leave herds alone. Any night hag without such an agreement must take other precautions, but those who do have an agreement should still take extra precautions given how untrustworthy both devils and demons are. Now, the most straightforward assumption is that each night hag is fully independent and has their own arrangements with the commanders, and this is a fine assumption. It works as an explanation. However, I'd like to suggest that there might be 2 levels of hag rustlers that work in a kind of sharecropping system. At the top are the Great Ladies, or arch rustlers, who control tracts the size of kingdoms and empires. These ladies don't do most of the actual rustling. What they do is make agreements with any threats so that their domain is safe. Then they charge the rustlers for their right to run their herds through the area and collect any larvae that they find. Of course, independent herders would still exist, but they're likely to be those so cantankerous that they prefer the hardscrabble and dangerous life of being menaced by vultures over the indignity of paying someone else a fee. As hateful as most night hags are, the thought of annihilation at the hands of Blood War armies helps them choose to work with a guarantee instead. After the hags have gathered up all those bloated larvae, they're going to sell them off. There are some end users who deal directly with the hags, but most people, even the kind of depraved person that traffics in souls, dislike dealing with hags, dislike going to Hades, or both. Think of a food that you like that doesn't grow around you, like fish if you live somewhere inland. If that's what you want, chances are you don't go to the coast and buy from a fisher, you'll go to a local merchant who does those deals and brings the fish to your area. It's pretty much the same with the soul trade. In our modern world, we recognize a split between wholesalers, or merchants who deal primarily with other merchants, and retailers, whose business is based on selling to consumers. These are just terms, though. The ideas of business to business and business to consumer come about pretty naturally in a complex economy. We can sketch out how that works in the soul trade. Our wholesalers are those merchants who go to Hades themselves, while our retailers buy stock from the wholesalers in the form of contracts and sell it on from there. The wholesaler's best model for making profit has them purchasing thousands upon thousands of larvae at once, especially if bulk discounts can be worked out, then selling packages of larvae to their public dealing contacts. As I alluded to earlier, the vast majority of soul trade business is conducted via various forms of contract. That raises the question, what happens to larvae when they are sold? Are they stored somewhere? It is of course possible to store larvae that have been purchased, either in a large pen or warehouse, or otherwise in something like a pocket plane or advanced bag of holding. I don't think either would be the most common solution for the merchants though. Pens mean only a finite number of larvae can be held, and larvae are 5 feet long and as wide as a torso, remember, while a magical holding space for a herd of even 1,000 would be prohibitively expensive. I believe it usually goes like this. When a merchant buys stock from a hag, that hag would immediately have her slaves magically mark the appropriate larvae, and that's about it for the moment. Until someone actually wants to redeem the contract, the hag would keep the sold larvae in their herd. When the larvae are wanted, either the hag or the merchant would use a gate or other transplanar magic to send the desired larvae to their new owners. Who provides this would be part of the contract. Of course, the hag would also charge a fee for continuing to look after sold stock. This is considered a baseline cost of doing business. Many of the planes are functionally infinite, so why don't merchants just transport the larvae earlier and skip the upkeep fees? There are 2 reasons. First, by doing that, the merchant is taking the cost and trouble of keeping larvae upon themselves. It doesn't just go away. Second, most planes do not want herds of putrid larvae wriggling about, no matter how much space there is. On the highest heavens, larvae would simply be unable to exist, either blocked from arriving or destroyed as soon as a purifying god was aware of them. Larvae's intrinsic attraction of hatred leads to most beings on all planes, but especially mortals of the prime material, being uneasy in their presence. Then, on the lower planes or in the astral, any group of larvae pose a tempting target for those who feed the always ravenous beast that is the Blood War. The only insurance against raids are hefty bribes to both sides, bribes which the night hags have already worked out. As you can see, most merchants would find it a lot easier to just pay the hags. So then, who are the merchants in the soul trade? Obviously, there is a range of mortals among them, as mortals get involved in everything. A few hags undoubtedly have large slave staffs and can handle their own sales to customers. Devils are also likely to get involved as soul merchants, exploiting the devil bureaucracy to handle the grunt work while using the trade to tempt mortals into bargains. A few Yugoloths dabble in dealing as well. Demons are not so likely unless they have non-demon servants. An entire staff of demons would be more likely to rip itself apart than to satisfy itself with commerce. Though these would have major players among them, I feel that the major part of the soul trade merchant class would be the genies and rakshasas. Both races of planar beings have societies based on a pyramidal structure, placing their lords at the top and layers of servants with differing privileges underneath. Due to their use of immortal slaves, Both are familiar with and unrepulsed by the idea of trading in souls. In addition, these slave households help the merchants in conducting business, especially writing and underwriting contracts, as well as dealing with trade partners. The rigidity of the master-slave connection lets the controlling master use their pawns as extensions of themselves, which allows for a kind of group accountability that could be, looked sideways, mistaken for a corporate entity. There's a third reason that these slave owners have an advantage in the soul trade. I mentioned earlier that the night hags are unpleasant to deal with at best. I'll quote one of my sources in saying that night hags view less powerful beings as only slaves or meat. While night hags give grudging respect to those they see as threats, it isn't always necessary or desirable to put the hags on the back foot. With a bevy of slaves, a genie or a rakshasa can keep cordial relationships by sending one of their own slaves as a messenger. You see, while a free person might stand up for their dignity if they're insulted, most slaves have been abused until they are used to abuse, so they are less likely to upset the hag's arrogance. Before I move on, I want to touch upon the topic of quality of larvae. If you're familiar at all with the soul trade, you might know that traders often try to pick the best grubs for purchase, but this stands against my earlier claim that all denatured souls, which includes larvae, are of equal potency. This is easily explained. First, larvae do often gain some defects as they are being kept and herded. Larvae are pretty roughly treated as they are rustled, so bruises and other injuries are common. Hags sometimes offer discounts on the worst specimens, usually selling them directly to thrifty end users willing to make the trek. For use as currency, only a typical quality larva will do. Second, it is rumored that night hags are able to shape living souls, or more accurately, souls of the freshly dead, which the hag has seized, and turn them into an especially potent form of larva. I'll touch more on this later, but due to how much effort it takes, these prize grubs wouldn't be sold in bulk. Another question to be answered is, where can soul trade deals be made openly? Obviously, the high heavens are totally out for any type of soul trading. In fact, any place where angels, archons, divas, and other celestials have influence is likely to be cold to the trade. Pretty much all direct deals with the night hags take place on Hades. The most famous hub for these exchanges is the Great Larva Emporium. Contract-only deals can happen anywhere, though it seems soul traders prefer places not directly ruled by any deity, even if that deity is as damnable as the trade itself. Trying to use soul bonds as payment on the prime material is almost always a mistake, even with fellow soul traders. Mortals who still live on the material tend to disdain the open back and forth trading of souls. In a typical supply chain, we would go from the resellers right to the consumers, but there is an extra step in the soul trade: circulation. Since larvae are both the currency for the trade as well as the major product, we've got to account for the time larvae spend as money. In this stage, we have two main players: the bankers and the currency holders. Bankers will be those merchants who have a lot of wealth to lend out at interest. Usually, bankers are deeply involved in the soul trade, but we are dealing with them here just in their roles as primary lenders and currency creators. The currency holders are those whose only interaction with the soul trade on most days is using larva notes or bonds when paying for goods and services. The most critical type of currency holder is the blood war mercenary. In fact, these are almost as important as the night hags to the overwhelming size of the soul trade. The number of larvae currently spoken for must be far in excess of the number which consumers want at any point. The need to hire mercenaries and their ever-climbing price is the engine that fattens the coffers of noble genies and the great night hags. The most well-known mercenaries of the Blood War are, of course, the Yugoloths, who I will discuss in some detail later. Slati are also known to fight in the war. Other races could also find themselves in war, beings such as salamanders, genies, and formians, though the sources don't specifically name them. Even mortals are known among the Blood War freelancers, though they tend to be individual agents rather than rank-and-file soldiers. And just to be thorough, while I know that both Garoliths and Modrons impact the Blood War, neither are significant mercenaries, so they don't have a strong interaction with the trade. The final stage of the soul trade supply chain is when the contracts reach the consumers. These are the people who actually redeem contracts in order to get larvae. The small fish in this link of the chain are liches and mortal mages, since they will be redeeming relatively few larvae for use at any one time. The big fish are the Blood War commanders and the archfiends. Recall that there are three main uses of larvae: as food, as a store of magical energy, and as stock for mangling into more powerful shapes. While some sources say that larvae are mostly prized for being transformation stock, I'll explain later when I get more into detail about devils and demons why I don't believe transformation is the main destiny of most larvae. And though these powerful fiends can use their larvae to perform magic, I believe that the main reason larvae are redeemed is to be used as food. Granted, demons and devils don't need to eat the way mortals do, but the chance to torture, that is, cook, and consume a helpless living thing is appreciated by all fiends. Commanders distribute larvae to raise morale, or rather to decrease dissent, in their army, or to reward a great victory. With the vastness of the Blood War forces and the omnipresence of betrayal, commanders can never give out enough larva bribes to their troops. Hopefully, that's all given you a broad idea of how the soul trade actually proceeds. The custom trade works in basically the same way, though there is more space for independent suppliers. Before wrapping up this part of the episode, I want to talk some about the general economic impact of the soul trade. Of course, even though souls are often used to buy more souls, other things are traded as well. Soul coins and soul gems are obviously passed around with some regularity, as are supernatural materials such as mithril, cold iron, and dragonhide. A substance called agony, or liquid pain, is also known to trade. Though agony can't be turned into new creatures, it seems as useful as larvae are for spell work, and though this is my own speculation, agony may even be delicious or satiating to fiends, most of whom are already known for enjoying the suffering of others. Larva byproducts, such as their bottled slime, are also bought and sold as secondary products in the soul trade. Gemstones and material quote-unquote precious metals are traded, but they only trade in large quantity or if they are of particular beauty. As I said earlier, most metals and stones can be easily conjured by beings involved in the soul trade, so only an amount or aspect that requires incredible effort to duplicate is worth trading for. Aside from contracts, the most important type of item exchanged in the soul trade is magic items. In fact, though it's unstated in sources, I think there must also be a thriving multiplanar trade in magic items. They are too often needed, too often sought after, and too valuable to resist some kind of market starting up. Now, I believe that this magic item trade is different than the soul trade. Angels and other denizens of the upper planes don't see trading in these items as repellent for one, and also this trade is probably not the kind of supply and demand production economy that the soul trade is. Most likely, the magic item trade is full of hoarders, item hunters, and wealthy collectors. At their most formal, magic item sales take place in a shop. Paperwork would be very rare in this trade as well. Mortal coins and other treasure are also traded on this cleaner market, which means most dedicated magic item dealers need some contact on the prime material plane in order to convert that coin into something they can use. And this right here is why, no matter how separate some buyers may think they are from the soul trade, the profane trade is actually the basis of value in the planes. Let me explain. As I've said, precious metals and gems don't have nearly as much value among non-mortals because magic means that a gem or bag of gold is easy to obtain. Even a mortal wizard of moderate skill can create a small fortune in gold with a single day's work. If great beings care little for coins, there is the possibility of barter, but as our scholar Graeber points out, barter generally arises in societies that already have the concepts of currency and quantifying value. Now, if gold and silver coins don't provide that for the soul trade, and I hope I've shown that such metals are at best a bad idea, then the obvious next candidate for a basis of value is the bulk souls of the soul trade. This trade is what helps to set the underlying ideas of what costs what which permeate the planes. Though an angel trading ambrosia for a mighty sword may never think about a despicable slithering larva, the baseline calculations that make a certain amount of ambrosia equal to a weapon of a certain power are all made possible by haggling over the vilest souls in existence. Part 3. Players in the Soul Trade. Understanding the roles that various races and beings play in the soul trade is extremely important to understanding how the trade operates. Though each individual does things for their own reasons and may even oppose the general picture that I'm going to lay out, I'm going to discuss elements that are broadly applicable, taking into account the race's drives and common factors. This should help to show why beings of each race tend to play the commercial role that they do. Now, the natural race to start this discussion with is, as I'm sure you've guessed, the night hags. Though night hags are undoubtedly related to the greenhags, anise hags, and so on, sources differ on whether night hags are truly of a species with the commoner sorts or not. We'll leave that question for another time. For now, we need to understand why night hags mainly play the part of suppliers in the soul trade and what they gain from it. Night hags feed on the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of others. They are among the few races often called pure evil by others because of how willing they are to crush even the possibility of dignity. This is possibly why the night hags have remained on Hades while their fellow Hadesians, the Yugoloths, fled to the plane of Gehenna. The crushing despair inherent to Hades simply can't do much to those, like the night hags, who want to inflict despair upon the multiverse. Through amassing vast herds of larvae, the hags have been able to carve out areas of neutral larvae ranges, and they direct the blood war away from their domains. The influence they wield keeps the most prosperous night hags secure from threats and free to pursue other interests, generally revolving around revenge or the torment of mortals. In my view, night hags in the soul trade would fall into 3 or 4 or 5 groups depending on how we divide them up. At the lower level are the opportunists, night hags who are seeking enough of a stake to truly get started as suppliers. Given their drives as I described them, it should be easy to believe that an established night hag would try to stamp out any competition. That means persecuting the upstarts. Without stock to pay bribes, opportunists find it hard to even start up a tiny herd without being attacked. These opportunists are those most likely to seek out specific mortal souls that have some power, often in order to create special larvae. I will speak more about these shortly. If an opportunist can build the proper stock, they become rustlers, those whose main business is herding larvae. The group of rustlers could be divided further into little rustlers and big rustlers. It's hard to say exactly what number of larvae makes one a big rustler. Instead, we can tell the difference between these groups and how they interact. Big rustlers absorb little rustlers. Little rustlers run away from big rustlers. When two little rustlers are in conflict, one tries to steal from the other, damage them, or push them out. When big rustlers meet, it's much the same. When a big rustler meets a little rustler, though, the big rustler tries, and often manages, to take the whole of the smaller herd and spit out the hag, dead or alive. This means that little rustlers are usually moving from place to place so that they can avoid predators, while big rustlers are more likely to stay in one area. The most prosperous rustlers can transition to being what I will call great ladies of Hades. These deal with the blood war powers to create neutral zones and rent out herding access. I'd split these into two tiers as well. The lower tier are your regular landladies. The higher tier are the countesses, who I see as having a similar dignity to the archfiends. Though I drew the title Countess from the late hag Countess Malagard, I don't know if she ever would have been a countess of this type. The soul trade countesses are the very top of the supplier ecosystem, and can have a massive influence on the trade and all politics of the lower planes. The best examples of these countesses are the trio of night hags that runs the Great Larva Emporium. A few times so far I've mentioned special larvae, so I'll explain what those are. While most larvae are created spontaneously in Hades and are roughly equivalent with one another, night hags are able to take as living souls and turn them into larvae, which are both easy to manipulate and still possessed of the potency that the soul had in life. Nearly all special larvae are sold to blood war leaders so that they can be made directly into more powerful forms of fiends. However, creating special larvae is both risky and difficult for night hags, so those that get deeply involved in the soul trade tend not to harvest souls like this unless they're hunting for their own pleasure. I'll deal with the devils and demons at once. Since most of my other pieces are and will be on these two races, I think it's okay to be brief here. The devils and demons are the most important buyers in the larva trade's supply chain. It's my belief that the main purpose bot larvae are used for is as food, especially as a defense against desertion or reward for victory. This seems like a good time to address an issue about how larvae are used. Specifically, the fact that the sources specify that much of the blood war armies are made by tortuously evolving larvae into war-ready forms. Firstly, we have to remember that these writers are bringing their own perspectives. It's easy to imagine that a story of an entire legion being formed from larvae in a single night, which may happen at best once every 1,000 years, looms larger in a person's mind than the rather mundane tasks of cooking and eating. More importantly, though, larvae-made warriors are not necessarily less troublesome or less expensive to create and maintain. For the devils, rigid discipline is demanded in the legion ranks. Discipline only comes from experience and practice. As devils move up in power from form to form, they retain their memories and therefore that crucial sense of discipline. Transforming a larva straight into an oceloth, for instance, means that the new creature would have no knowledge of its duties or abilities. For demons, such a newborn fiend would not be fully aware of the deadly confusion that is demonkind, therefore also not being prepared to defend themselves. In both cases, better individuals are made by the usual steady uplift. Special larvae are at times worth transforming, but often must be sheltered like a pet and looked after while they absorb their senses of duty and self-preservation. Naturally, demons are much more likely to suffer a useless apprentice, and so are less likely to seek special larvae for transformation, but even devils don't do much transformation. As far as numbers are concerned, remember that only a fraction of dead souls become larvae in the first place. Likely there will be at least as many petitioners on Beator and the Abyss each, and they can readily be added to the force. Larvae would simply never be needed to make up sheer numbers. As replacement troops, Bulk larvae would only be used if a specific leader needed to replace a specific unit without much direction needed, like needing to replace a unit of Goristro just to have them charge at a wall. But even so, such troops are going to be less powerful and less cunning than those who rose to the ranks, so to speak. We can think of this issue from another angle as well. If bulk larvae made for effective warriors, there wouldn't really be much need to hire mercenaries. Speaking of mercenaries, let's discuss the Yugoloths. I think this is the first time I'm discussing them in the history of the Blood War series, but they do have an interesting and significant role to play, one that needs a bit of untangling. In short, the Yugoloths are a race of fiends who are motivated by greed and superiority. Where devils oppress and demons destroy, Yugoloths self-aggrandize or boast, somehow being energized by the poverty and lesserness of those around them. Within the Blood War, the most prominent mercenaries come from the Yugoloths. The most treacherous mercenaries are also Yugoloths, however, and often whimsy leads them to be treacherously effective in gaining better prices. Within the soul trade, Yugoloths are the most pivotal category of currency holders, since Yugoloths are the only beings who hold the majority of their wealth in soul trade bonds and cash notes, that is, the largest other than the bankers themselves. Yugoloths don't care about ruling or influence in general, so they don't buy objects of art or regalia or anything like that. They just stack their cash so they can taunt the needy with it. When discussing the Yugoloths and the Blood War, which is important to understanding their impact on the soul trade, there are two things that it is important to understand while we are looking over the sources. The first is the value of the Yugoloths as mercenaries. This is something that is obscured in later sources, but it's key to understanding their role in the Blood War. There is a notion in some sources that Yugoloths can travel more widely than demons and devils, and also that Yugoloths won't perish forever if they are killed in the 9 hells, as devils would, or the abyss, as demons would. To me, this is nonsense as a reason for their utility. The Yugoloths have never been shown to be able to travel more widely than other fiends. It's generally only alluded to when trying to figure the Yugoloths' place. Also, the idea that the Yugoloths are hired because they are at less risk presupposes that demon and devil leaders actually care about the vast majority of the beings under their control, at least enough to exploit them. Any amount of studying the fiends will show you that they do not. The reason that the Yugoloths are hired is simple. Body for body, Yugoloths are more effective than either the demons or the devils. The most common Yugoloth form is the Metzoloth, and it's noteworthy that this isn't even the weakest Yugoloth type. Now, clearly, Metzoloths are far more powerful than Manis, Nuparibos, Dretches, and Lemures. In sources from before the World Tree period, Metzoloths were far stronger than unit leader fiends like Osculiths and Hezro. The reason for this is their ability to use magic items and the fact that few fight without an array of gathered and purchased arcana. Later sources make no mention of this and therefore downplay the Metzoloth's threat. Other low Yugoloth types, such as the Durgoloth and Piscoloth, remain powerful, but by the World Tree period, all of these were considered weaker than Osculiths and Hezro, and this has remained the case ever since. I feel this is an error. If the Metzoloths don't prove a threat even to the slightly powerful fiends, there's little reason to hire them. Neither devils nor demons are wanting for numbers, as I hope I've shown. For the Yugoloths to have any leverage, and especially enough to be hired despite being known and eager turncoats, they have to be crack troops, maybe lacking the unit cohesion of the devils, but making up for that with individual skill. The second thing we have to recognize when studying the Yugoloths is the biased nature of our sources. Clearly, the sources come from different perspectives, but the skewing in regards to Yugoloths is significant. While the oldest texts do appear somewhat neutral, there is a noticeable pro-Yugoloth bias in the old wheel sources, especially those coming from the city of Sigil. It seems possible that people wanted a neutral voice on the Blood War and so avoided devils and demons, but in the process they simply imbibed a third set of lies. This is the origin of frankly ridiculous claims such as Metzloths being as strong as pit fiends, or Yugoloths being the orchestrators of the Blood War, or Yugoloths being the oldest race of fiends, and so on. While I cannot specifically disprove these claims, we must place them, which are admitted several times in the sources to be Yugoloth claims, alongside differing accounts from the devils, demons, Garoleths, deities, Slotty, and so on. Especially when investigating Sigil sources, keep in mind that Yugoloths appear to have a grasp of posterity, which is less true of other fiends. However, we should also recognize the significant move away from this standpoint in later sources, as they began to seriously downplay the Yugoloth's importance and influence. It seems that the two sides of the Blood War attempted to reassert control over the historical narrative at this time. In my rough hypothesis, the World Tree period leaned towards Devilkind, while the World Axis period skewed to the demons, so much so that Yugoloths were classed with demons for a while. What perspective dominates these days is difficult to say, but in our current era, the Yugoloths have regained some of their lost stature. I'm going to talk about the next two groups in the soul trade at the same time, Liches and Mortals. As far as their direct roles, Liches are mainly consumers of larvae, while mortals tend to be currency holders or magic users. Both groups provide important contract workers in the Blood War, and these contract workers are very likely to be paid in cash notes. The major universal value of Liches and Mortals is their access to the prime material plane, which means spellcasters can summon fiends there despite the usual restrictions. Nearly as valuable is their ability to deal and trade without arousing suspicion. Though few people like Liches, those who do deal with them tend not to view them as agents of another being. Aside from this, there are many skills and talents that the living have which can be useful to powerful figures across the planes. When getting involved in the soul trade, both mortals and Liches must be sure to take care of their own souls. As someone gets more notoriety in the soul trade community, they'll become a natural target for those seeking a cultured soul to sell. Obviously, physical and magical wards are necessary, but that's not all. You'll have to scrutinize every trade, contract, and relationship you get into from that point forward. Any of them could be part of a scheme to get at your soul. And a word to the wise, don't listen to anyone suggesting you pawn off your soul with the intention of buying it back later. Once someone has your soul, you will almost certainly never get it back. Hiring someone who could properly get a simple pawn contract to sign would probably cost you more than you wanted to get for your soul in the first place. Deities also play a sizable role in the soul trade. On the surface, it could be expected that deities would simply oppose it due to this abuse of souls, but as I spoke about earlier, the vast majority of petitioner souls who end up on the lower planes would not have been deemed worthy to enter most heavens. As for those who reside on the lower planes, such as gods of murder, plague, and hatred, it seems that either they have less need of petitioners and thus are satisfied, or they are too afraid of retaliation from the fiends to act. Whatever the answer to that question is, there is one fact. The deities themselves cannot stop the soul trade or the blood war. If it were possible for any deity to stop them, they would have been stopped. Remember, though there are deities on the lower planes, there is no god of devils and demons the way there are for elves and dwarves. I cannot explain why no deity can end the blood war. I'm merely observing that this must be true. Despite this truth, some deities do involve themselves in the blood war. Instead of charging out themselves, though, they send armies of their champions and followers to tilt the conflict in favor of the side which that particular group hates the least. The main effect that deities have on the soul trade is the effect they have on demand for mercenaries. Sometimes, when multiple deities are on each side at the same time, demand will be low all over. If a powerful deity is leading one side to great success, mercenaries will be in low demand on that side, but in high demand on the other. Many other races also play roles in the soul trade and blood war. As said earlier, genies and rakshasas would be well represented among soul trade merchants and bankers. Garoliths, also known as demodans, are called the fourth race of fiends, but unlike the other three, they are largely uninvolved in actions outside of their home plane of Carceri. Some may be for hire, but Garoliths by and large hate the other fiends and would rather destroy them all. Slotty are noteworthy co-fighters with the demons in the Blood War. Apologies for being reductive here, but Slotty are thought of as beings of chaos, and their interests more closely aligned with those of the demons. Slotty don't get involved in the Blood War very often though. Their noteworthiness is for the outsized effect they can have on battles. When they do get involved, it's a kind of coincidence. For example, Slotty deciding to wade into a fray that's already been happening, or making their own sudden attack which a group of demons then joins. A rare few Slotty are even available as warriors for hire. Usually though, Slotty on the lower planes are there to scavenge the corpses left behind by a great battle, not to fight in one themselves. Races which can be considered counterparts to the chaotic Slotty, the lawful Modrons and the value-neutral Romani, also have an impact on the Blood War, one that does need to be discussed, but not here. For now, let me note that despite their involvement in the Blood War, their effect on the soul trade is mostly on the demand for mercenaries. Individuals can and do play different, fuller roles in the soul trade, but they don't have much group-wide influence. Of course, not everyone in the multiverse is tolerant of the trade in souls of the mortal dead. However, we have to put aside the morality of our world when we think about opposition to the soul trade. It is natural for us in our time to have thoughts of liberating souls or helping them to find a deserved rest. Those aren't a concern for anyone opposing the trade. Remember, most believe that the souls which become fiends or larvae are unworthy of the higher planes and, therefore, cannot be rescued. Agents of the purifying deities do strive to prevent souls from active temptation by fiends, but, as we discussed, this is a small minority of trading compared to the overwhelming larva trade. Those who go in for larger attacks on the soul trade, such as raids on larva herds or assassinating bankers, don't do it for heroic reasons, but as a practical action aimed at disrupting the Blood War. Celestials who raid the lower planes, such as angels, Gardenals, and Eladrin, typically attack Blood War forces directly, but may strike at a soul merchant if they are doing business with a celestial army's target. Mortal agents of purity deities are more likely to become entangled with and disruptive to the soul trade because they work on a more individual basis. In all of these scenarios, there is a constant. The attacks are specific, not systemic. As of the present, there isn't a known and concentrated effort to take down the entire soul trade system. Now, speaking of disruptions, plenty of these are caused by the competition inherent to the soul trade. Raids from devils and demons are always on the minds of the night hag rustlers, but a hag's most likely attacker is another hag who wants her turf, her herd, or both. The merchants can cause troubles as well. Apart from calling in hits on their enemies, it is possible for merchants and bankers to start financial bubbles based on the overuse of advance contracts. A run on a banker in the context of the soul trade, which is when more larvae are redeemed than the banker can provide, will likely devolve into a great deal of bloodshed as creditors first seek to punish the overstretched banker and then fight each other to divide the banker's wealth. As one banker's fortune is often tied up with many other fortunes, a single run could complicate and jeopardize commerce for years. Still, this is generally a side effect of economics and not scheming. Dealing in the soul trade, even to disrupt it, would be too dirty for anyone who really wants to take it down. Part 4. A Tour of the Trade. Since we've now discussed how the soul trade operates and who operates it, let's discuss where it operates. The shortest answers to that question are, number 1, the lower planes, which is obvious but not right, and number 2, everywhere, which is more correct but pretty unhelpful. Instead of leaving it there, let me instead point out some of the places most essential to the soul trade throughout the planes. Of paramount importance to the trade in larvae is the plane where they are harvested, Hades, also known as the Grey Wastes. On every layer of this plane, it's possible to witness night hags and their retinues driving seemingly endless herds of putrid larvae. It's said that one of the most productive places to gather larvae is Underworld, a vast walled-off enclosure on the third layer of Hades. The hags who have access here are either very wealthy or very, very desperate, making it an expensive and perilous last try for success. Perhaps more vital for the actual trading is the Great Larva Emporium of Oinos, named that way here because that's the name of the layer it sits on. At this emporium, major dealers come to meet with big rustlers to sign contracts involving millions of larvae. There are also smaller traders, those who come seeking discounts or larva byproducts, and even a few tourists who view the auctions and powerful personas as a spectacle. Despite all that massive traffic, the Emporium is somewhat hostile to those who are not major buyers. The hag covey seem to have made few provisions for those who can't provision themselves. After all, those who will be able to trade big at the Emporium can house themselves or will have the ability to travel by magic. With no official protections for anyone but the actual traders, it's very difficult to run a long-standing shop. It is possible, and there are a few, but it requires paying a great deal in guards or bribes, or both. On top of that, the operator will need to be a savvy diplomat in order to avoid any grudges. This isn't a place for the cash draft or the common chancer, but it is one of the main engines of the soul trade. Many more people, including most merchants, will be based in other trade hubs across the plains. While there are many places that prohibit trading in souls, that just concentrates the trade in those that do allow it. Perhaps the two most well-known trade hubs in the multiverse, that is, Sigil on the Outlands and the city of Brass on the elemental plane of fire, would be thriving centers of the soul trade. Outside of the lower planes, these two cities are where you are most likely to see soul notes used openly and casually. Larva herds, on the other hand, are much less welcome due to the street congestion they can cause. So, expect to figure magical transport into every contract you strike in these places. Probably the place with the highest consumption of larvae per being is Naratir, the city of the undead, which is located on a layer of the abyss known as Thanatos. Naratir was at one time claimed by the demon prince Orcus, and then by the drow deity Kiaransali. Currently, it's not clear who the city's master is, or if there is one. Regardless, among Naratir's undead population is the largest known concentration of liches on any plane. It is a dangerous place to do business due to the many feuds that rip through the city at any one time, but a steady buyer in the city can be the foundation for a soul merchant's entire success. Cities in the Nine Hells of Beator strive to make themselves the center of all trade, and naturally the devils think that the way to do this is to somehow control the soul trade. Chief of these cities are the city of Dis, which spans the entire size of the layer it shares a name with, and the city of Menoros, which is just located on its self-named layer. Both of these are well known to planar travelers, though possibly Dis is slightly more popular for extra-planers. Minoros is where the soul coin mint is sited, which means that it would be one of the few places where one soul coin would be equal to one larva. There is another city which I feel deserves notes on the layer of Minoros, and that is Jangling Heater, the city of chains. This is the home of the Chitons, or chain devils, who carry out the largest regime of torture that has been or ever will be witnessed. The reason that I believe Jangling Heater could be significant for the soul trade is that it would be a perfect place to produce the soul-like substance called agony. Think of it like an artificial sweetener against the sugar that is the larvae. Maybe that was an unneeded analogy. Anyway, what's most important to take from this is that the devils do have designs and working schemes to bring the vast wealth and influence of the soul trade under their control. The hiring of mercenaries happens almost everywhere that the blood war rages, but since deals usually need some kind of mutual trust, neutral territory is preferred. Aside from the major trade hubs of Sigil and the city of Brass, there are 3 key sites for hiring. The first is the crawling city of Gehenna, the seat of the mysterious general of Gehenna. The best Yugoloth sellswords will be found in this crucible, so it is common to see devils and demons conducting business. Then there are the towns of Ribcage and Plaguemort, which house gates to Darkspine in Beator and Broken Reach in the Abyss respectively. These are places where mercenaries can go to be hired by one side or the other. Plaguemort is a busier city for trade, but of course both are in the shadow of Sigil. Part 5. Getting involved. Many who are listening to this may sense an opportunity for profit in the soul trade. Others might hope to manipulate it in some way, to reach some other goal. But think about this. Many mortals have been destroyed forever through dabbling in the soul trade. However, I would feel that I had left the job half done if I did not outline how mortals get involved in this evil business. View what I am about to say not as instructions to follow, but as a document of what is happening, even now, to hundreds of different people. Obviously, money can be made as a merchant by investing in the larva trade. The safest way to do this is to build a store of mortal wealth and convert that into larvae. You'll need to find someone willing to make such a trade, and these people are quite rare. To my mind, there are 2 types who will offer a mortal their first major buy of larvae. A fiend, or other creature who is using this transaction as part of a scheme to entrap the new merchant, or it is a person, usually a mortal, who has extensive business on the material plane, but also enough soul trade connections to make the deal happen. Be careful though, there are more of the former pretending to be the latter than there are of the latter. Some mercenaries in the Blood War get in it so they can build a stake in larvae directly by being paid in cash notes. Others view the mercenary life as their main pursuit. Regardless, it is much more straightforward to become a mercenary than to become a merchant. Only exceptionally skilled and equipped combatants would be considered worth hiring. Very likely, mercenaries find themselves guarding installations or on dangerous, low probability, high skill suicide missions. Also of great interest are assassins, and I don't just mean the stealthy types. Anyone willing and able to carry out targeted killings would be in high demand at any time. Many of the most famous assassins have less grace than an owlbear. The third major way that mortals can get into the trade is as recruiters or seducers of souls. The custom order souls ripped straight from the material plane can be very valuable, worth enough that complex schemes are still worth it. Devils, demons, hags, and other soul tempters obviously deceive mortals when they can, but the truly powerful will be able to see through illusions and avoid the simpler pitfalls. Mortal agents can be very valuable in bringing a person to the point of signing their soul away. Of course, these tempters are capable of convincing their target to meet with a friend, but I don't see why a mortal couldn't learn to write the kinds of soul-binding contracts that devils and demons do. Don't ask me how to do it though, I don't know. If the secret is out there, trust that it's held in close confidence and will require an exorbitant price to gain. Part 6. The Soul Trade and the Blood War. With the grounding we've explored through the rest of this episode, I'll now tie the Soul Trade to the goings-on of the Blood War. The most obvious effect is on mercenaries, as we've been discussing. Due to the Soul Trade, there is a widely accepted currency which mercenaries can easily be paid in, eliminating the need for barter or a kind of reputation credit system. Again, Graeber helps make clear that barter doesn't come before money, and I invite you to read his explanation further on your own time. For now, what's important is that the Soul Trade makes dealing with mercenaries much easier. However, it also makes double dealing easier, something that the Yugoloths exploit. After all, topping an amount of cash is simpler than finding a clearly equivalent gift or trade. The weapons and armor used by many in the Blood War are magical in nature, and most magic items require life force to imbue them with power. This life force can be taken from larvae, and multiple are needed for even relatively simple items. The Soul Trade makes it easier for the forges to get the larvae they need to run as well, but it also opens up a new weak point. Disruptions in the Soul Trade, such as the death of a key banker or a particular herd being wiped out, can severely hamper an army's progress in the world. For example, a force heavy on mercenaries may be abandoned in enemy country if their cash notes suddenly turn up worthless. Hellfire engines and other constructs would also be heavily dependent on magic forges continuing to operate. Raids on larva herds are a known and expected tactic, with the targets being specifically those that directly supply to an enemy forge. Causing a system-wide disruption is too daunting for any to attempt it, so economic attacks have to be targeted. This does require a great deal of spying and information gathering, which are both possible roles for mortals in the trade and services which the portable nature of soul currency makes easier to manage. Perhaps the most ambitious plots tying the trade to the war are those that simply use the war as a means for more profit. War is a business. One of the somewhat recent chiefs in our world, a man called Eisenhower, referred to the military-industrial complex. Similar things happen throughout the plains. It's been said that certain forces on either side are completely in the pocket of this banker or that merchant, all achieved through a labyrinth of contracts that could wipe dozens or hundreds of beings from existence if a single clause is broken. Major battles could come about due to the machinations of traders who have not set foot in the lower plains over the past 10,000 years and won't do so for the next 100,000. As strange as it may seem, there are those who view the eternal conflict that has laid waste to continents as something like a chicken, whose only purpose to the farmer is to lay eggs and then be slaughtered. Conclusion. I felt that a thorough exploration of the soul trade was missing from the existing body of scholarship, so it became a subject that I wanted to investigate myself. To know that there is a trade which is so despicable yet has so little known about it did not sit well with me. I believe that understanding the soul trade is key to understanding life outside the material plane. The base of this trade is in the usefulness and ease of handling of the larvae. Its major suppliers are the night hags, and it makes most other commerce possible. Even those who hate it can't help but interact with it. The information presented here is heavily drawn from sources in the libraries of the Wizards of the Coast. What I've done is to bring these sources together with a specific focus on the soul trade. I present my sources so that other scholars can do their own research into the trade and perhaps find details that I didn't. understanding these worlds is a collective project, and I am very pleased that you've taken this step with me. Thanks.